I am Regina Cortina. I'm here at Teachers College in the program on International and Comparative Education. And I would like to introduce today Tony Verger. Tony is going to talk about the constitution of global education policy market. Tony is a professor, a researcher in the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and he's back in Barcelona after being in Amsterdam, and that's why he's called the Ramon y Cajal Researcher. It's a special grant program they have in Spain to bring back researchers to Barcelona. He's in the Department of Sociology, and he has recently published a book on globalization and policy market. Thank you, Tony, for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you first at all to Teachers College for inviting me to be in this so exciting symposium on globalization, education and comparative education. I think that this is a great opportunity for me to think more about methodology and epistemology, because I like to do a lot of empirical case studies, but I think that this symposium is pushing us to elevate somehow the level of the debate to a higher level of abstraction. So in this presentation, I will try to engage in these themes of the symposium on globalization, context and comparison by basically doing four things. So first, I will reflect on how globalization alters education policy analysis. Second, I will advocate for the necessity to do more research on the policy adoption level. Third, I will argue that the dominant approaches to the globalization and education policy are not necessarily well suited to analyze policy adoption, and we need to think about alternatives. And finally, I will use the research I have done on public-private partnerships in education and the dissemination of public-private partnerships for education as an example of how this premises my work, but this premises my work for the study of other global education policies like conditional cash transfers, school-based management, child-centered pedagogies, and so on. Let me start with an anecdote. When I was in Washington, D.C. At the beginning of 2009 doing ethnography on the World Bank, I was there doing a similar research to Karen Mundi's one, trying to understand the evolution of the privatization agenda of the World Bank. I attended the presentation of a book launch in the library of the World Bank by Harry Patrinos and colleagues, and this book is titled The Role and Impact of Public-Private Partnerships in Education. And in this book launch, Harry Patrinos and colleagues, they were trying somehow to convince the people of the bank working at the operational level of how important and how interesting would be to implement this type of policies. So I thought this was a very interesting presentation, and for me to be there also to understand how the World Bank is not a monolithic actor, that you have internal policy entrepreneurs trying to persuade their colleagues that they should go in a certain direction. But the most interesting thing to me is that some months after, I was in India. I was in India for a research on civil society and education for all. We had a workshop with different stakeholders, and one of the stakeholders was a UNESCO representative that told me about a very interesting seminar coming in the following week on public-private partnerships for education. She was telling me that this is the next big issue, you should come. And I joined that seminar. It was in a 5-star hotel. And you had there people from the World Bank presenting on public-private partnerships for education. Actually, the person from the World Bank, Mr. Sam Carlson, he's the head of the office, the education office in the World Bank in New Delhi. He was presenting the same report that I was seeing the book launch some months before. So somehow I understand, now I understand how policies travel, although I would say maybe this is more report traveling than policy traveling. But I thought it was interesting to understand what is one of the sources of power of the World Bank, as Karen Mundi was saying, the impressive communication policy of the bank and the the territorial clout of the bank is one of the sources of power, the way they can disseminate ideas somehow. But the most interesting thing for me is that at that time, I was interested in understanding the diffusion of policies by the World Bank. But by sitting in that room with the World Bank person showing the report to many state ministers of education in India, different stakeholders, I thought that maybe I should change somehow my approach. And I was thinking about what are these Indian ministers and other stakeholders thinking about this report that was written in Washington, D.C. What is the meaning they are giving to the content of this report? And why do national decision makers goodbye this type of ideas that Mr. Sam Carlson was trying to sell in that very high-profile seminar? Let me make a step back and talk about education policy analysis, the global education policy process. So these are the natural steps in education policy: problem identification, agenda setting, policy formulation, policy adoption, implementation, evaluation. So what is globalization doing to the policy process? Basically, it's contributing to a sort of deterritorialization of the policy process, and more elements and steps of the policy process that were conventionally more nationally grounded, they become globalized, and global actors intervene. Of course, we could talk about the paradoxes involved in the fact that global actors are those that are defining which are the local problems, or that the global actors themselves are those that are evaluating the policies that they are promoting. But the point I want to make is that somehow the globalization of the education policy process is introducing a new step that is very interesting to look at, which is the recontextualization of these external education policies, and also to look more seriously at how translation is operating in these different levels of the policy process. Of course, translation is also happening in sort of national education policies, but globalization, I think, is making this object of study more interesting. So what are the two more dominant approaches to analyze global education policy or the globalization of education itself? We have been talking a lot in these 2 days about world culture theory. World culture theory is finding, let's say, common responses to globalization in the education field. They use usually regression analysis of longitudinal databases, document analysis to justify their findings, and they usually focus more at the level of global agendas, state formation, and so on. The second dominant approach is what I call anthropology studies, that, let's say, that if the world culture theory celebrates global convergence, somehow anthropological studies, they will celebrate divergence. The limitations of the world culture theory, they are well known in the sense that actually they assume that many countries in the world having ministers of education, having very similar contents in the textbooks, this means that education is the same all around. Actually, the mechanism of diffusion, the mechanism of isomorphism, is actually not a causal mechanism. It's something that needs to be explained, and reading world culture theory sometimes is very disappointed that they never go behind that. And in the case of anthropology studies, the main problem to me is that sometimes they stop at the micro level. They produce very interesting, empirically rich case studies, but sometimes they are not ambitious enough when it comes to producing generalizing claims. I would say that these two approaches, they find different outcomes, but they are not incompatible somehow. I think that the main problem is that they look at different moments of the education policy process, and that's why they find different results. So in the case of world culture theory, they are, as I said, mostly looking at the global policy formulation, global agenda setting. And in the case of anthropological studies, they look more at the implementation level. That's why there is this clash of results between the two of them. So my argument is that we really need to look at this step that is very much neglected in comparative education. Maybe the exception is precisely the center, the Teachers College, and its work on policy borrowing and lending. But in general, this policy adoption moment is very much understudied. It's very challenging methodologically also to analyze policy adoption. How ideas become influential is a sort of object that is not very easy to grasp empirically, and probably this is one of the explanations why there are not so many studies as I would like at this policy process step. So what are the methodological challenges when we want to look at policy adoption? Let me look at the divergence between these two dominant approaches I was telling to you. And what I would like to suggest is that somehow, it's not like these approaches are not well suited to analyze policy adoption, but somehow there should be more cross-fertilization between the two of them. So what I suggest, and maybe this is very risky linguistically, is that the sociological institutionalism should learn from anthropological studies when it comes to do field work at the global level, or in the way global policies are being promoted and adopted. Because, as I said, most of the times they are not really producing empirical data at this level. Maybe Leslie Bartlett and colleagues would agree on that, because they are promoting precisely this idea with the proposal of the vertical case study. But I also think that influence should go the other way around, in the sense that maybe very microanthropological studies, they should learn from sociological institutionalism the fact that they should try to have more theoretical ambitions, and they should go from the micro to the macro narratives as well. And to socialize ethnography, I think that it's very important to try to build explanations based on mechanisms. What I mean by explanations based on mechanisms? Well, mechanisms can be defined in very different ways. We had a great presentation in the last CIS conference by Roger Dale, talking about the dozens of definitions of mechanisms, causal mechanisms, that you can find in social sciences literature. But a very basic definition would be that a mechanism is a process that accounts for a causal relationship between variables. Building an explanation based on mechanisms means that we need to look at policy outcomes, in my case, policy adoption, as a function of mechanisms in context. So this means that the same mechanism might have different effects according to the context where it's applied. And precisely this premise is the one that is building a research question that is also one of the questions that we want to respond in this symposium. So what is context, and how best to conceptualize context? I hope that I will go through it in a successful way. So when we want to study policy adoption, what are the research questions that more or less are master questions that could frame different case studies? So first, who and how do promote global education policies? Why do countries buy into global education policies? And if we want to formulate the question in a different way, under what conditions is global education policy more likely to be adopted by countries? So in the case of my case study, we should read here, who and how do promote PPPs in education? Why do countries buy into PPPs? And a more fundamental question, maybe more epistemological or even ontological question, is how, why, and when new global policy ideas matter. Of course, the methods that can be used are very different. The methods I used in my research on PPPs are a combination of document analysis, interviews to key stakeholders, both people in international consultancy firms, international organizations, but also national stakeholders, and of course observation. And observation, I think, that is probably the most challenging method in this type of research because you have to be there. And for instance, in the case of that meeting in India, I was there just by a coincidence. And it's not always easy to be invited to these places. So in the case of my research on PPPs, I did observation in this book launch on public-private partnerships in Washington, D.C. I mentioned the meeting in New Delhi. I also mentioned. I was also invited by UNESCO IEP to attend a meeting that was titled Challenges of Financing Basic Education, Revisiting Solutions Involving the Private Sector, and many of the panels were about public-private partnerships. The audience in this case was basically ministries or people working in ministries of education from African countries, and this was also a very enlightening experience for me. And more recently, I participated in Manila in a symposium on public-private partnerships. I was speaking together with the Vice Minister of Education, and at that time, he was telling me that they were thinking about or they are thinking about implementing a big voucher system funded by the Asian Development Bank. So I got a lot of information from him. He told me who are the consultants that are behind this policy. He sent me all the documents for getting my comments. So I also had very interesting data on the Philippines, although I haven't exploited it yet. So I will present results of my research on PPPs that have been already published in the Journal of Education Policy. And this article is very much about the promotion of public-private partnerships. But as I said, I became very interested in also looking at the adoption side. And in this case, I also did a case study with a colleague from the University of Amsterdam, Sanne van der Kijk, that is very much trying to understand the policy adoption moment in India in relation to public-private partnerships. So the first thing that we need to do in this type of research on policy adoption is to look at who is behind the promotion of this policy. And here, I think that it's very interesting to use the concept of policy entrepreneurs. In literature, other people is talking about theorizers, framers, brokers, but I think that the concept of policy entrepreneurs is capturing the nature of the actor that is behind the promotion of this type of ideas. Policy entrepreneurs can be defined as actors advocating for the advance of new programmatic ideas. They encourage practice communities to pay attention to certain problems and particular policy prescriptions. They are usually based in knowledge-based organizations, whether it's an international organization, a university, a consultancy firm, a think tank. I think that is interesting, the concept of policy entrepreneurs, because somehow they evoke this metaphor of a global market of education policy ideas. In this market, different groups, networks, and actors are competing to promote and sell their policy products worldwide. The sources of power of policy entrepreneurs, or at least successful policy entrepreneurs, are material, the political clout, and the membership to different networks. And I think that this last element is very important, in the sense that somehow these policy entrepreneurs, most of the times they are so creative and innovative because they are based in organizations with a lot of networks working at the same time. So for instance, in the case of the people that designed PPPs for education, they are basically in the World Bank, and they learned and they imported somehow the label of PPP from other sectors like water sanitation, health, and basically they made a sort of bricolage in Mundi's terms with previously existing ideas on education privatization. So this type of being part of different networks is a very important source of power of policy entrepreneurs. And of course, material factors are very important when it comes to understand why they promote successfully ideas, but the way they frame ideas is also very, very important. Actually, frames and framing is the most important weapon for this type of actors. This means that beyond the quality of the ideas that they promote, is very important the way they package them and the way they sell them to different audiences. Very briefly, some rules for effective framing. the ideas that are promoted, they need to be empirically credible. They need to have some sort of internal consistency. They need to be credible. They need to be evidence-based. Although sometimes maybe they are not very empirically credible, but since they repeat them so often, they look like they are credible. Sometimes another rule of effective framing is that the ideas that are being promoted, they need to be framed in a way that is sound with prevailing policy paradigms, public sentiments of the context where they want to push for these changes. Another rule is that there should be a sort of balance between familiarity and innovation. Of course, policy entrepreneurs need to innovate, but they don't need to innovate so much because somehow the policymakers that are going to take over these ideas are usually risk adverse. They don't want to introduce very radical changes in their education system. So that's why this bridging between familiarity and innovation is a very important framing tactic. And finally, these ideas, they need to look feasible, both at the technical and at the economic level. The PPP idea has been very much promoted in the last decade in very different reports, websites, from these international organizations I was telling you. So it's a very important policy idea in the global education agenda, specifically for developing countries. So I invite you to read all this literature. I did. It's quite repetitive, I have to say. So that's why it's more interesting doing empirical research, interviews, and so on. Because, as I said, a way of promoting ideas is really repeating the same message once and again. Because this is a way of constructing truth, and I think it works quite well. Who are the key policy entrepreneurs behind these ideas? Of course, here in these reports you can see many organizations behind, but what is the network that was really behind it? I would say that first the anchor was the World Bank, the economics of education division of the World Bank, together with the IFC. They work very close together with the CFBT, the Council for British Teachers, an international consultancy firm from the UK. They are as I say, the core of the network. They were working at the beginning of the millennium very much together with James Tooley. He's a very famous international consultant, quasi-scholar, that is very much promoting low-fee private schools. He became a sort of uncomfortable ally of these international organizations, so he became a bit a part of this network because he had a very anti-state discourse, and the World Bank and other international organizations that they have member states, they couldn't cope with this type of discourse. So basically their ways advanced in parallel, but not together anymore. More recently, the Asian Development Bank has been working with UNICEF Asia, also in understanding how the private sector can be included to promote education for all. And UNESCO and the World Economic Forum, they also talk about public-private partnerships, but in a very different way. They basically talk about a sort of corporate philanthropy thing. So how is our network of policy entrepreneurs defining public-private partnerships? Basically, they are a contract between the public and the private sector in which the public sector buys a service to the private sector one for a certain period of time at a certain price and according to results. The most important message in the PPP's programmatic idea is that the state needs to change its role very drastically. Somehow, the state should stop providing education and should contract the private sector to do so. And the state should have a bigger role as a funder, regulator, and evaluator of education. This is, I would say, the core message of these policy entrepreneurs. And I think that they are, of course, very ideological, but also very idealist in the way they think that the education systems should be organized. They really believe in the metaphor of the market to organize the education system. Basically, they consider that the state should give free choice to families to choose the best school because they know what's better for their children. A school choice will introduce competitive pressure in the schools, so the schools will have to compete for these students somehow, because they will receive, according to the number of students, higher levels of funding. So this competition will improve quality, will improve the efficiency of the education system. That's why they say, of course. Then the state steps in, evaluates what the schools are doing, and according to the results of the evaluations, they will introduce incentives for the schools, and the schools will compete again for better quality services. And at the same time, the evaluation system should be translated in a public information system to inform families about what are the best schools, what are the schools that they should try to choose for their children. So this is a very complex, sophisticated way of organizing the education system. Then after we can discuss whether we agree or not, but this is the key message that they have. So this is what policy entrepreneurs are doing. Now we need to look at the other side of the coin of policy adoption, which are the policy adopters. So why policy adopters buy into global education policy? And for instance, here I would like to discuss a bit the work done by McNeil and colleagues. They have these scholars from, I think that they are based in the UK. They have had a very important project that is titled Creation, Adoption, Negation and Distortion of Ideas in Development. And I think that this is a very ambitious project to understand how ideas travel in the education, in the development field, not only in the education. And they basically identify, after years of research, two main conditions: that ideas need to be strong, the content of the ideas need to be strong, and their promoters need to be powerful. And I think that they actually have a very flat understanding of the reception moment. And that's why we need also to have a theory or hypothesis on why policy adopters buy into global education policy. So we can have very different argumentations. The first one is a rationalistic one. So they buy global education policy because it works. So here we assume that the actors, they have optimal information. A more constructivist approach, which is the one that probably I would be closer to, would say that adopters perceive that global education policy work or can work in their place. That's why framing is so important, to make people believe that really this policy can work. Of course, we have skeptic versions of policy adoption, and I think that the work of Professor Steiner Kamshi is very good in this terrain to make us understand that, okay, sometimes local policymakers are using global categories as a way of attracting international funding, but at the end of the day, they also they use the local codes and the local policy preferences once they really have to implement these policies. In the case of the Bologna process in Europe, it's also very interesting to see how national governments have mobilized the Bologna process as a reference to justify previously defined policy preferences, like privatization of education and other policies that they are not related to what the Bologna Declaration is saying. But overall, what we have to do is to really look at the climate of reception and whether this is conducive and hindering. This means that we need to talk about context, and context can be defined in very different dimensions, very different variables. Some of them are more macro, others are more micro. Some of them are semiotic, others are non-semiotic. And I will just list them because I don't want to run out of time. But of course, if there is an education crisis and a sort of reform urgency, it will be more feasible that policymakers look for international policy solutions. The level of risk aversion can be hindering because, as I said, most policymakers, they don't want to introduce very drastic changes in the education systems. So that's why usually the policy change needs to be evolutionary and cumulative. the current form of the education system, what is the tradition, the history of the private sector involvement in a particular country can also make a big difference in the case of the promotion of PPPs. What are the public sentiments in education in relation to the public sector in terms of public opinion, education conceptions, values, and identities? Of course, government ideology, the position of key stakeholders, and what I call, or what we call in this symposium, the logics of intervention of decision makers. So what is the meaning that somehow these decision makers are giving to external ideas on the basis of previous experiences, political interest, local needs, and particular policy preferences? So what happened in the case of PPPs when it comes to the reception side? So I would say that the PPP's frame is very successful. The PPP label is very successful in the way that is very sound with the dominant development policy paradigm. PPPs also sound familiar to many because they have been applied before to different sectors. It is sound with ideas of new public management that are very fashionable in global education agendas. The PPPs also, they have a very accommodationist power. Somehow different political ideologies, they feel comfortable by using the concept of PPPs, independently of whether they are conservative, social democrats, etc., etc. And actually, in this meeting I attended in UNESCO, there was a big negative reaction from the audience from Africa to some of the presentations on PPPs, and the moderator of that table from UNESCO was a bit sarcastic, and he said something like, come on, partnerships is a lovely word. Working in partnerships is a beautiful objective, so who can be against it? Trying to transmit this power of the partnership label. And of course, where I think that is weaker, the idea of PPPs, especially in low-income countries, is that markets with equity are very expensive, actually maybe more expensive than implementing public sector reforms, and they are very technically complex. So this is probably a point that is not working in favor of the promotion of this idea. And of course, in the way they are presented, they still looked very much like privatization. So for instance, if we take one of the diagrams that it comes in this World Bank report on public-private partnerships, we can see how they try to understand PPPs in an evolutionary manner. The World Bank really likes to understand policy making in this sort of evolutionary way. So this is a low PPP, probably they mean that this is bad. And this is a high PPP, which is an integral PPP, which is the perfect education system we should try to ambition. And what do they say? What is an integral PPP? Basically, 100% of education provision should be private, and the way of funding should be based on the voucher model in which the funding follows the demand. So this is very similar to a privatization agenda. And actually, in one of my interviews in one of these, with one of these Polish entrepreneurs, when I asked for the origins of the idea, they say this to me. I think originally we started to think about PPPs in education and the role of the private sector as part of the privatization agenda, which was also unfortunate, of course, because we aren't thinking about privatization as a goal. The goal would be improved outcomes, and if getting the private sector involved would be useful, then it's useful. So we weren't thinking about privatizing. This quote actually reminds me about Lakoff's book on framing, Don't Think About an Elephant. There is a moment in he talks about the Reagan administration, that they were into corruption, and Reagan was on TV saying, I am not a thief. So if you say, I am not a thief, the message that you are transmitting to the audience is that actually you are a thief. So when they say that we are not thinking about privatizing, they make me think that they really are thinking about privatizing. And actually, this is not only my perception. This was also, for instance, the perception of many people in this UNESCO meeting I was telling you. So the people sitting in the audience was very negative with many of the presenters. They were using very, I would say, risky metaphors about PPPs. They were saying that the car industry is private and the state is regulating it, and we have very beautiful cars. We should do the same with the education sector. So many people working in these African ministries of education, they felt like their identity was sort of attacked or challenged, in the sense that they were told that they should do things differently, that they should own the schools, that they are not able to provide good quality education. So this was one of the reactions I observed. And the other reaction that I more empirically observed, it was a sort of selective adoption. For instance, in India, many education reforms today are framed under the label of PPPs, and actually a very big loan from the World Bank has been recently approved to support these education reforms in secondary education. But what I saw is that the logic of intervention of the Indian policymakers, and actually in the case of the Philippines, is so different to the one of the World Bank. So as I say, the World Bank has a very ambitious reform agenda. They really believe in the market metaphor in a very ideal way. And the logic of intervention in India, for instance, is very much about cost efficiency, and the same happened in the Philippines. So in the Philippines, for instance, they want to use PPPs to avoid building new public schools. They want to give vouchers to kids to go to private schools, to kids in public schools to go to private schools. But all the metaphor of a school choice, school competition, quality assurance, this is totally absent from the PPP discourse at the local level. So, and I think that this quotation from Michelle Weaver and Manning represents very well what's happening with PPPs in the education sector. This is an observation that he did in relation to PPP research in other sectors, and he says that, like many public policy concepts, PPPs have become mired in a muddle of conceptual ambiguities. To some extent, this is attributable to the way in which a new policy doctrine come into good currency. Everyone at various stages of the policy making tries to fit conventional activities into the new mold. To conclude, I have argued that beyond convergence, divergence, the study of global education policy change needs to pay more attention to the adoption moment and build explanations based on mechanisms in context. Key actors should be seen as an entry point to the study of policy adoption, whether they are decision makers, policy entrepreneurs. Comparison provides an empirical foundation to understand the adoption conditions. So I would advocate for more comparative research in this terrain. And we have to advance toward this double movement in global education studies, in the sense that we should try to ethnographize institutionalism and sociologize ethnography. So the conclusions of my PPP study somehow are that the PPP idea has been formulated and disseminated by a transnational policy network of education experts, which is not especially wide, but strategically placed in influential international organizations. Somehow the PPP frame, because of its accommodationist condition, has been more successful than the PPP policy program, which has been adopted in a very selective way. And in this terrain, I would like to use the concept of PPPs as a floating signifier, in the sense that it's so ambiguous that local policymakers are giving different meanings to it according to their policy preferences, and to legitimate sometimes their pre-established policy preferences. So overall, the case study of PPPs show that for programmatic ideas to become influential, they need to be framed effectively, but also resonate in broader policy paradigms, public sentiments, and tuned with the logics of action of local decision makers. I would like to finish with the same image that I started, by saying that to many institutionalists, this picture is a good evidence of the globalization thesis and to the fact that globalization is having common responses worldwide. But institutionalists, they would stop their research here. And to me, however, this is the starting point of global education policy studies and of a fascinating research agenda that should focus more determinantly on how and why global policies are adopted, retained, and translate it in different contexts. Thank you very much.
It's coming from the Institute of Education in London.
All right.
Present.
Well, thank you for inviting me to comment on this very interesting presentation. All right, can you hear me now? All right. Anyway, well, thank you for inviting me to comment on this very interesting lecture that was it was very interesting to see how you have penetrated the World Bank and other global organizations to see what kind of power they exert and the means that they use to do so. One thing that came into my mind several times as I was listening to your presentation was maybe something that was missing from your presentation, or maybe not from your research, but at least from your presentation, and that is variance. I mean, how do we explain the variance in adopting these global policies across countries? I think there is a tendency to see these global policies as homogenizing effects, or having a converging effects. And I think to a large extent that is very true, but there's also a lot of differences when you start looking closer into individual countries. I have not done a study like you have on these international bodies, but I have been looking at neoliberal policies and their implementation in some European countries and trying to explain the variance, because they're actually huge in the extent to which neoliberal policies on education have been implemented and how to explain that. And allow me to say a little bit about that. I did a study a couple of years ago trying to explain exactly that in the cases of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And what was really striking was that Sweden, as you probably all know, is an extremely social democratic country, and it has implemented market policies on education to a much further extent than in Denmark, which have been ruled by liberal governments for 18 years since the 1980s. How to explain that contradiction? I'm not going to tell you the answer. But I come up with a set of explanatory factors. They can, of course, be discussed, but I try to, with the help of the comparative case-oriented method, to identify factors that can explain this variance. And now I am in the process of extending this research to comparing Sweden and with England, and there I found out that Sweden is still way ahead of England in implementing these policies. And that was a shock for me to realize, and that begs, as you say here in America, that requires an explanation, a comparative explanation. Anyway, so I am, as a comparativist, I'm concerned with variance. I want to explain this to the extent it is possible, with the help from comparative methodology and theories drawn from political science, comparative politics, and so forth. And therefore, this brings me to some questions I want to ask you about variance. Let me see, where did I write it down? I did do some scribbles here. So the first question I want to ask you, that is, in your studies, whether you have come across striking differences or contradiction in understanding how the World Bank policies have been impacted on low-income countries. And the next question, which is related to this, is that whether your findings have contradicted the theory of convergence. That's my second question. And then I have a last question, which is a little bit different, and that is to do with the World Bank itself. I would like to know if you have, since you are going through all these publications of the World Bank, which is very impressive, it must be very tiresome reading, but you did that. So therefore, and to spare myself reading all of these, I'm going to ask you instead whether you have found that the research is very biased towards its own policy agenda, or do you think that they stick to the rigor of scientific inquiry?
Okay.
That was the words.
Yes.
Thank you. Come sit down here. So, I would like to see if there is any other questions, so he can answer all the other questions.
Thank you, Tony, for a wonderful paper. There was so much to think about there, and I have 3 thoughts that I wanted to share with you. One is I'm intrigued by your call for ethnographers to sociologize ethnography, and your call for us ethnographers to be more ambitious theoretically. And this reminds me of, I'm going to be parochial for a minute, but it reminds me of a skit on a comedy show here in the US called Saturday Night Live, where Sarah Palin told Hillary Clinton that she didn't get the Democratic nomination just because she wasn't ambitious enough, which, as we all know, Clinton is quite ambitious. I think ethnographers are too, theoretically ambitious. I think the distinction, though, is what you said we should do is build explanations based on mechanisms, and that a mechanism is defined as a causal relationship between variables. And that's asking ethnographers to buy into a language that we don't buy into, to buy into an epistemology that we're not invested in. I would say that instead, ethnographers working in this area that I'm familiar with, and I've been part of this effort, are really trying to blend 2 things. I'm going to try to come back to Joe Tobin's lecture from last night. We're trying to blend actor network theory with multi-sided ethnography as one approach to that kind of theoretical ambition. And I wonder if you care to comment on that. The second one, your point about context, I'd love to spend a day talking about your context slide. And I think there's so much there that we really need to push this concept of context and ask what is context, but also when is context and where is context, and think more textually about that. My final point is just to you about the public-private partnership element. And while you're in New York, if you care to do more ethnography on this topic, I thought I'd tell you about this. The MDRC is now participating in the country's first social impact bond at Rikers Island for 16 to 18-year-olds. So in this arrangement, private investors fund the intervention through a nonprofit contractor. The government pays the contractor only if the program meets its goals of reducing recidivism. Goldman Sachs is providing the financing. Bloomberg Philanthropies is providing the grant support. And then there's an NGO providing the education. So in case you want to do some field work while you're here, we have lots of this going on. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you. Would you have any other question, Gita?
Thoroughly enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Actually, I agree with almost everything you said. There's 3 things just that I observed a phenomenon that I find interesting, and maybe you too. It seems like global actors that sell, to use your language, which I like, sell global education policy, they adopt the fee structure that we nowadays have. Like it's free if you just take the normal blend, but then you have to pay exorbitant prices for some global education policy. And I'm thinking, and I just saw Henry sitting here, like Indonesia, the government of Indonesia adopted a very expensive model of English and IT in classrooms. Mongolia gave money to Cambridge Education, a business, to implement a very expensive, like the premium global education policy. Nepal, we had a talk earlier this semester, also adopted And so once you do that, you do have, as a state, a legitimacy problem. How do you take public funds and give it to the private sector? And that's also, again, that talk about the colleague about education in Nepal, but also in Mongolia and in Indonesia, all these three cases where the price is very high of adopting global education policy because it's a PPP, and the ones really benefiting is the private sector. They solved that legitimacy crisis by that spillover argument. And that's, I think, a very recent phenomenon of the last 1 or 2 years, how a government solves the legitimacy crisis of PPP, which is takes taxpayers' money and gives it to the private sector. I was wondering, how you see that point. And the last one, and then under some rules of effective framing, I would say, not from the reception side, but from the lending side, it is to make an expensive package, because then you cannot replicate it by local means, because then that keeps that dependency from global education policy. The last thing I wanted to say, PPP as a floating signifier, I think that's totally true. It's like saying that something have inflationary usage, like in civil society building and others. But probably I would say there is a time axis underneath it. When something becomes a floating signifier, it's because it has become everybody and nobody's reforms. So it's already at a stage of active dissemination and all that. And maybe there needs to be like a temporal consideration there.
Thank you. Do we have any other question? Okay, Tony, so we have maybe 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for all the comments and questions. I would like to start with Leslie, and I think that I have been more successful than Karen Mundi when it comes to provoke anthropologists. So and actually, I base some of the comments I made on the wonderful book edited by Anderson Levitt that you have a chapter there, because I had this feeling that it's not like there is no enough ambition, but that sometimes the case study is an end by itself. And of course, I haven't reviewed all the literature on anthropology. I have recently edited a book on global education policy, and we have different case studies, and I also have the same feeling when I read the different case studies that still we need to do much more if we want to compete somehow with world culture theory. And I think that my point on trying to make explanations based on mechanisms is trying to go from the micro to the macro, and trying to grasp not only one single variable. Maybe that definition that I put there is not very fortunate because it makes me look like very, very positivistic, but trying to understand really how there is a group of variables that they work as a mechanism, and that they really are replicated in different contexts. And these mechanisms can have a semiotic, non-semiotic nature, can be related to power relations, but this is something that we really need to grasp with very empirically rich case studies, which in this sense I would converge with the anthropological agenda of trying to really make these inferences. And in this sense, I don't know if you are very familiar with the debate on critical realism. It's very much, I would say, a debate in sociology as a response to very much postmodern trends. But what they are suggesting is that we need to build explanations by retroduction. And by retroduction, as in contrast to induction or deduction, they mean that we need to understand what are the conditions that make something happen. And I think that this is my main message, that somehow comparative education and the type of research that I would like to do. It's not like I am doing it and other people is not doing that. We should have this ambition to try to identify through comparative analysis, to contrafactual analysis, what are the conditions that make something happen. In my case, I am interested in policy adoption, but we could also think about other different phenomena that we want to explain. I am also very interested in Susan's ideas on variance, and I think that if I have to identify in the case study that I was presenting, what are the key factors that are related to explain variance, I would say the history of the private sector involvement in education, somehow, because, as I said, it's not the same implementing a PPP in a country where you have to create the private sector than in a country where you have a long tradition of having the Catholic Church and other...
That happened in Sweden.
Uh-huh.
There was no private sector.
And they
Less than 1% of children went to private school, yet they have outsourced education on a scale that you don't even see in England.
Yeah, but for sure this will make a difference in the final form of the PPP. As I say, the logics of intervention and the public sentiments, I would say, that are very, very important. I don't know what was the crisis in the public opinion in Sweden at that time, but I can tell you that it's probably very different to try to promote privatization in a country like India, where I would say that part of the culture is very elitist and support privatization of education, than in some countries in Latin America that there is a strong feeling, even between the middle class, that education is a public good and should be equitable and so on. So these contextual variables are very important also to understand variance. And I recently did a research on the implementation of new public management ideas in Catalonia, in my country, and basically what is very similar to what you were saying about Sweden, because the Social Democrat government is the one that was implementing new public management ideas in the sense of more school autonomy, stronger directions, teacher evaluation, and so on. And they stopped at the regulatory level because then the Conservative Party came in and they stopped with the agenda of new public management. And why is that? I think that the Social Democrats, they wanted to improve the public sector, and maybe they were wrong, but they thought that new public management would contribute to that. But the Conservative, they don't. They think that new public management is expensive, and they just stop implementing that because they don't really want to improve the public sector, and they prefer contracting the private one. So maybe we can do a paper together on that.
Because social democracy is heavily involved in my explanation as well.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed also Gita's comments, and let me make a brief comment on what you were saying about the effective framing and what's happening in the lending side. And I think that in the case of PPPs, one of the most important problems of this programmatic idea is that it's really, really ambitious, and it generates a lot of dependency. It's telling countries that you are not supposed to provide education because you don't have the incentives, the public sector is not efficient, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, it's telling them, but you need to install a very complex evaluation system, you need to provide incentive to stakeholders, bidding procedures. So there are a lot of paradoxes in this discourse, and I would agree in this sense with you. And there's another question that Susan did, and I think that is quite interesting in the sense that, because I thought that I would be too long, I have a slide on that. So if you don't mind, I will put it, because you were asking me whether the World Bank is biased when it produces knowledge, and actually there is something I have been working on with a student from the University of Amsterdam. Well, this is first of all the PPPs report. I was telling you, I looked at the references in the list of references, and what I saw is that most of the references were from authors that are based in the World Bank, or people that produced a paper for a seminar in the World Bank. So number one would be, I would say, like these self-referential references. Then the second type of references that were also quite numerous, but not so much as the first, were related to sort of policy briefs, other international organizations or international aid agencies' knowledge products, and basically academic publications that they are supposed to be the highest quality, I would say, knowledge products. They are very much marginalized by the way evidence is presented in this type of documents. And I also, well, this is a literature review that the CFBT, the Council for British Teachers, they did. These are the partners of the World Bank when it comes to promote PPPs. And what we did here was a sort of bibliometric analysis, which is trying to make network analysis of academic literature on PPPs. And we did a research on all the literature on PPPs, vouchers, school choice. So we used different keywords, and we identified this network of publications. And the different points, the size of the point means that this is the publication that has been quoted more often. That the color means the results of this publication. So the red points, they show, they are publications that they show, they have conclusions in favor of PPPs. Okay. They say PPPs work, they are good for school effectiveness and so on. The sky blue publications, they say that PPPs don't work and they are very critical with PPPs. And then the dark blue, they are more like in the middle, okay? So they say maybe they work for school effectiveness, but they generate education inequality. So they are sort of balanced. And they are close together according to the number of references that they share. So that's how we did the network analysis. We could establish other criteria, but, well, what is concerning with this graph is that somehow social sciences are not very good at cross-fertilization, so you can really have two very epistemic communities living in parallel and nothing happens. Probably in experimental sciences this couldn't happen, never. But in the case of what I was looking at is that, okay, let's see what these people from the Council for British Teachers is meaning by a literature review. And this is a literature review on PPPs, and the yellow points are the points that are basically included in their literature review. One of the more, I would say, fashionable words in the development field is this idea of evidence-based policy. But what we are trying to say with this type of research is that actually evidence-based policy is not happening so much, but policy-based evidence is what is going on. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a good way to finish. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Do you know how big the research budget is? How big? I mean, let's say something about the part. Oh, sorry, I know we have finished, but
okay, no, we don't need to finish with that. In the year 95, I think it was the big reform, or 98, the World Bank decided to become a knowledge bank with President Wolfenson, but this, and they say that they should become a sort of knowledge resource for developing countries, international aid agencies, and so on. But this didn't affect so much the structural funding of the DEC, that is the research department. Actually, I think it's around $40 million, something like that, and this hasn't changed so much. What has changed is that the researchers in the bank, they are supposed to compete for external funding, and sometimes they are more successful or not, but I don't have the numbers. But they usually get what are called trust funds from international aid agencies to produce knowledge products. In theory, according to the demands of the international aid agencies, although they still have a lot of capacity to set the research agenda.
Right, enough from me.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.